Yesterday, the United States was riveted by yet another story of an alleged terrorist attack, this time at a recruiting center in Chattanooga, Tennessee, not too terribly far from where I live. Once the news made its way around the internet and became national news, I began to see several interesting things. The first of which was that Americans tend to come together in the face of such terror and assert a kind of nationalism that for most is a sign of a rich unity. Also saw that ISIS, yet again, took responsibility for the attack. Not so long ago, we were all riveted by images of ISIS insurgents on a beach beheading 20-something Coptic Christians, after which they issued a statement to the nation of the cross. And I was struck by that. ISIS, of course, insisted that that message was to America. But the nation of the cross is much larger than any one particular nation of the earth. The cross. It's a rather ubiquitous symbol in our world, infused with so much religious significance. That's only because the first century Christians seized upon that image as the image they would use to depict the gospel, the cross. It really is nothing more than state-sponsored terrorism. In the first century, the Romans used crucifixion quite often and quite effectively. I think, for example, of the uprising, the Spartan Revolution, how Rome seized those hundreds of Roman slaves who had become insurgents against Roman power and crucified them, lining them along the Appian Way so as to terrorize those who might rebel against Rome. Roman authors would often have to discuss the terrors of crucifixion in roundabout ways, because crucifixion was a horror in the ancient world. And then there's Paul, who says, I preach one thing, and that one thing is Jesus crucified. And of course, to us, that seems like a no-brainer. Of course we talk about Jesus. But to first century ears, what Paul says when he says, I preach one thing, and that one thing is Jesus crucified. Well, really? That's the image you want to seize for the world? To look at Jesus? Roman peace, the peace that the world gives, is always peace at the end of a sword. The world's peace is propped up undergirded, the foundation upon which it's built, is violence. And that is not the peace that God brings. The peace that God brings is brought in a cross. It's always interesting to me that Muslims are so concerned at the depiction of Muhammad. And you end up with violence if that image is less than perfect, if it's scandalous. And here Christians are seizing upon this one image of God that is an image of state-sponsored terrorism. The cross. The cross is that place at which God reigns over the world in a power made perfect in its weakness. It sounds foolish to the world, Paul says, to preach Christ crucified. But that is the very wisdom of God, to use such brokenness to heal, to use such violence for peace. When Jesus rises from the dead and greets his disciples, and they're huddled in a room for fear, and fear at the sight of him, Jesus' first words are, "Peace to you." Because it's in the cross that there is forgiveness. It's in this terror that there is peace. Doubtless today so many will begin running toward violence as the response to yesterday's attack. Doubtless so many will say that we return eye for eye, tooth for tooth, kind for kind. But that is not the way of Jesus' cross. It is not the way God works in the world. The cross, nothing more than state-sponsored terrorism, is the means that God uses to bring about peace, even with one's enemies. That's a hard message. But it is the message that we Christians proclaim. There is one thing I preach, Paul says. And that one thing is Jesus crucified.